back with Fitness Athlete Friday. I told you on Wednesday that you would be seeing me twice this week. And so usually you'll see me with my Jerry PT cap on for modern management of the older adult. But I have teamed up with Kelsey Valentine, who is an internal pelvic floor physiotherapist, to offer clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum. And so we are days away from launching our first online cohort. It sold out within like 4 hours. It was insanity. And good morning, Kelsey. So we are just about ready to launch. And so I have been deep diving into a lot of the literature on pelvic floor anatomy. Kelsey and I have been having a lot of conversations about how we're going to conceptualize, bring this material together. And so we're really excited for the product and how it has turned out. So if you didn't get a chance to get into our June cohort, our next online cohort is September 9th. So that's when the next pregnancy and postpartum course will be offered. So make sure you don't delay and you jump onto that cohort. Okay, so today I thought that we would talk a little bit more broad umbrella around the pelvic floor. So I am not an internal pelvic floor physiotherapist. I do see a lot of women during their pregnancy and postpartum at Stave Off. So we have a Strong Like Mom class where we help moms in their first 6 to 12 months postpartum transition back into exercise safely. And we did that because there was a huge need and there was a huge gap in a lot of the knowledge around how we can help people who were looking to start exercising, were avid exercisers prior to getting pregnant or delivering their newborn, and people who have different pelvic floor or different type of issues resulting from pregnancy and labor and delivery that were looking for a bit more guidance for getting back into exercise. But as an orthopedic MSK therapist, I had so much apprehension around looking at the pelvic floor or conceptualizing the pelvic floor. I felt like I was always referring to women's health, and luckily Kelsey and I worked together, so we had a lot of conversations. But that tended to be the conversation that I had with a lot of therapists. You know, there's a need. I have these avid CrossFitters, weightlifters, powerlifters who are either have never had children and are leaking on the platform, who are trying to do double unders and have to wear a panty liner, have to go to the bathroom before, are leaking. Or I have these women who want to continue exercising during pregnancy, are ready to get back to it really soon after having baby because it's a big part of their identity, and we just don't have any resources. And so if anybody is willing to do a PhD, I will tell you right now that in terms of pelvic floor dysfunction in CrossFit, there is very little literature except for, you know, what is causing incontinence in terms of CrossFit movements. So we know that things that are higher impact and repetitive are the bigger culprits for incontinence to show up in the CrossFit sphere. So thinking double unders and box jumps, those are the two highest prevalence, as well as running. And then from a strength perspective, usually squats and cleans and deadlifts are the three big strength movements that we're going to start to see incontinence, especially as load starts to increase. So we kind of know where the problem is, but what do we do about it? And so there really is no literature on individuals who continue to participate in strength-based sport during pregnancy if it increases their risk of pelvic floor dysfunction. We don't have any literature on return to CrossFit, in return to even return to running, which is a very common recreational activity. What we're basically getting is you are to do nothing after baby for 6 weeks, and then you're cleared for exercise. And to me, that didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me because there's no literature on what the 6-week mark stands for. Why is it 6 weeks that we are just doing nothing for 6 weeks and then we are going back? And then how can we just say that you've had this big trauma and then you're going to go back to exercising as soon as you feel ready to, you're given the A-OK and you can go back 100%. So as I started thinking through these problems and going through my own pregnancy and postpartum journey, talking to Kelsey around some of her interventions from an internal pelvic floor physiotherapist perspective, all of these things that were coming up just reminded me of regular muscle physiology, regular muscle rehab. So if you think about the pelvic floor as muscles, then we know a lot. We know a lot about how we are going to recover from a muscle that has been strained, which is what would happen to the pelvic floor musculature during pregnancy, right? Like we're experiencing an increased weight down on the pelvic floor that's creating a stretch, that's creating extra work. You're almost creating like an overuse. I'm simplifying, of course, but you're increasing the demand on the pelvic floor. And as soon as demand exceeds capacity, then we start to experience symptoms, i.e. incontinence. We have muscles that can be too tight, which is a lot of CrossFit athletes are hypertonic in their pelvic floor and start to get leaking symptoms. We can have muscles that are too weak, which is often what happens after baby because there's been a trauma there, and therefore we're getting symptoms. So we're seeing the exact same principles happening for how we would rehab a strained muscle, an overused muscle, or a torn muscle, but except when we're thinking about pregnancy and postpartum time, we are thinking more that the symptom is not necessarily pain. There can be pelvic girdle pain. There can be issues with your pubic symphysis. You can have vaginal pain with intercourse. But for a majority of people we would be seeing, majority of the fitness athletes that we would be looking to help recover and return to exercise, the symptom is incontinence. So instead of pain, we're thinking of incontinence. And the principles of how we are going to gradually bring them back to exercise is going to apply. So the amount of time that we would expect that we need a full recovery of no rest would be the difference between, for example, a grade 1, which is a superficial peroneal tear, which doesn't affect the musculature, versus a grade 2 through 4, where we're having, grade 2 is almost like, it's like a partial tear. So if we're thinking about it in relation to the shoulder, like grade 1 would be like an overuse injury, rotator cuff tendinopathy type of presentation. A grade 2 peroneal tear would be like a partial tear. So we're knowing that it's probably going to take a little bit longer than a tendinopathy to recover, but we don't necessarily need any sort of surgical intervention. When we're looking at 3 and 4, we're thinking about full thickness tears. That's where during labor and delivery, you're getting multiple stitches. Recovery is going to be longer. You're going to probably be immobilized for a much longer period of time, and then you're going to gradually return to exercise. And so when I started conceptualizing some of the pelvic floor methodologies the same way that I was thinking about a shoulder rehab, then everything started to make a little bit more sense in terms of my clinical reasoning for how I was going to progress my athletes through, what questions I was going to be asking in my subjective. So I'm going to be asking about tears. I'm going to be asking about the weight of the baby, because that's going to make an impact. Weight gain during pregnancy, any sort of complications, any sort of past medical history. Has this happened to you before? Have you had an injury like this before? AKA, have you been pregnant before? Because that's going to impact recovery. All of these things that we talk about through ICE as part of the process around, what we are going to do to do a good subjective exam, we can transfer over. And then if we are trying to help individuals and it's not progressing and we're not doing well, we're not seeing the results we want to see, we refer. So we create a therapeutic alliance with internal pelvic floor physiotherapists that we're working with or that we have a good relationship with, and we refer on. We send a letter saying, this is what we've done. This is what I think is happening. Could you assess and treat and give your opinion? And so I think we are in this period now where we have more and more therapists that are interested in trying to figure out how we can help these people, not only through the initial stages of the labor and delivery process at 4th trimester, but how do we get them back to high level sport? Because I'm a competitive weightlifter, and a lot of women's health really advocates for meeting pressure where you're at. So they advocate against Valsalva, and they advocate against using a belt because it changes the pressure system. That isn't a story that I want to use, because for me, we know that Valsalva and using a belt increases the stability of the spine. It's going to make me lift more, and I'm trying to make nationals next year. So as a musculoskeletal therapist working with an internal pelvic floor physical therapist, now we're trying to think about how to gradually load the tissues. And this is where we're in a big gray area. So if I don't have any research on how to do this from an internal pelvic floor perspective, because there's been no literature on return to sport and incontinence symptoms done, then I have to be pulling from pelvic floor physiology and anatomy. We have to be pulling from what we know from other areas of the body and trying to use our clinical reasoning appropriately. So if we're going to be doing that, if we're thinking about it in terms of muscles, if we're thinking about postpartum recovery, then if we were to do any sort of intervention and we're starting to apply any sort of exercise program, what would be acceptable in terms of level of pain? And what would be acceptable in this case in terms of degree of incontinence. So if we have an individual who is coming to us and is a 10 out of 10 pain or is leaking with the first step that they take when they're jogging, then we want to make sure that we are bringing their system down to a level that's appropriate for them, managing their symptoms, and applying a rehab exercise program that is going to make sure that we are minimizing their symptoms while continuing to get them stronger. So that is what we're going to do with a person who is returning postpartum. So if they are starting to experience symptoms at 50% of their 1 rep max, let's bring them down to 40, start working their strength there, and then start progressing. And then if they are starting to experience mild leaking, then that might be okay. If they were experiencing a huge voiding of their bladder at 50%, and now at 50% they're getting a minimal leak. And so that would be like when we are doing some of the tendinopathy rehab protocols that, 2 to 3 out of 10 pain is okay. But as soon as we start going into 4 out of 5 plus pain, then we need to make sure that we're bringing things down. So in that way, again, we're starting to conceptualize the pelvic floor as we would with any other muscular rehab program where we're monitoring symptoms and we're trying to adjust exercise programs appropriately. So at the end of the day, when I started to talk to a lot of orthopedic therapists, there seemed to be a lot of apprehension around thinking about the pelvic floor and how they could help. But if we start to conceptualize this in the same way that we would clinically reason through any other muscular injury, I think we're setting ourselves up for more success because we know, like we're physical therapists, we know muscles, we know how muscles recover. And of course, there's going to be issues that could complicate things. Pudendal nerve issues can come up a lot in labor and delivery, but there can be contributing factors from the neck that are affecting your shoulder rehab. So as much as there's other things and it seems like it's more complicated, really we have the clinical skills and the clinical reasoning and the background knowledge to be at least starting to help some of our athletes get back into exercise. So I hope that conceptualization kind of set off this light bulb moment for you, because it really did for me, where I kept thinking that this was this gray area and I always had to refer. But when I started thinking about how things were progressing through pregnancy, how things happen with labor and delivery, it's a muscular injury. And so we are trying to recover from a muscular injury. And so for myself, I didn't have a very complicated vaginal delivery. And so I was able to get back onto an empty bar, which is like 20% at 3 weeks. For somebody who had had a grade 3 tear where that tear was more complete, it went more into the anal sphincter, that probably wouldn't be possible because bleeding would be more severe, recovery time would need to be managed more, and you would probably need a little bit more follow-up. And so we're not really talking different languages, we're talking different body parts. And so I hope that you guys found that helpful. We're going to be deep diving a lot more into this when we start going into the online material of the pregnancy and postpartum athleticism or athlete course for clinical management of the fitness athlete. And I hope you guys are tuning in. I'll be in here a couple more times, probably talking a little bit more around the pregnant and postpartum athlete sphere. So I will talk to you guys soon. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Bye.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.